6 years ago, my mother looked me straight in the eyes and said, "A woman who chooses a paycheck over her family doesn't get to call herself a daughter." I never forgot those words. Not when I accepted the promotion she hated. Not when I moved across the country. Not when she stopped asking about my life and started treating my sister like the only daughter who mattered. And definitely not 6 years later, when my mother suddenly called me with a favor. She needed me to get her son-in-law, Doug, a job. She told me I owed the family that much. What she didn't know was that Doug wasn't asking just anyone for a job. He was asking the president and CEO of Cascade Freight Solutions. The company she wanted me to call? I was the one running it. And when my mother, my sister, and Doug walked into my office expecting me to open a door for them, they had no idea I had spent the last 6 years documenting every single moment that led us there. Because before I decided whether to help them, I had one question they were finally going to answer. Did they actually need me? Or did they only need what I'd become? My name is Dana Whitfield, and I am 34 years old. 6 years ago, my mother stood in my parents' kitchen in Belhaven, Ohio, population 4,180, and told me that a woman who chooses a paycheck over her family doesn't get to call herself a daughter. I had just accepted a promotion. It came with a company car, a 14% raise, and a travel schedule that would keep me out of town 2 weeks a month. My mother heard travel schedule and stopped listening. Last month, she called me and asked for one favor, one phone call. She wanted me to get her son-in-law a job. What she didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that the company she wanted me to call into was the one I now run. If you've ever been the one who left, the one who got called cold for it, stay with me, because I promise you the ending is not what you think. Before I get into it, if stories like this hit somewhere real for you, go ahead and hit subscribe, but only if it actually earns it. And tell me in the comments, has anyone in your family ever asked you for help right after they spent years acting like your success was an inconvenience to them? I want to hear it. Let me take you back to where this actually starts, because the phone call is the ending, not the beginning. Belhaven is the kind of town where everybody's mother knows everybody's business by Tuesday. There's one stoplight on Main Street and a diner called the Coach Light that's been serving the same meatloaf special since 1987. My father, Frank Whitfield, worked 29 years at the feed mill on Route 9. Same shift, same steel-toed boots, until his knees gave out. My mother, Carol, ran the church nursery on Sundays and the neighborhood watch phone tree the rest of the week, which is really just a fancy way of saying she knew who was struggling before they told anyone, and she never let them forget she knew it. I have one sibling. My sister Meredith is 2 years younger than me, and from about the time she could walk, she was the daughter my mother understood. Meredith liked staying close. She married her high school boyfriend, Doug Pruitt, moved 4 streets over from our parents, and built a life that never required my mother to explain it to the neighbors. I was the other kind of daughter. I liked numbers. I liked the part of group projects nobody else wanted, the spreadsheet, the schedule, the thing that made the chaos make sense. I got a partial scholarship to study logistics and supply chain management at a state school 2 hours away, and my mother cried at my going away party not out of pride but because 2 hours felt like an insult to her. I want to tell you about the first crack, because it's small, and small is how this always starts. When I was 19, home for winter break, Meredith got engaged. My mother threw her an engagement dinner at the Coach Light, invited 40 people, and gave a toast that lasted 6 minutes. 11 months later, when I made the dean's list for the second straight semester and got a summer internship with a regional freight carrier that beat out 300 applicants for the spot, my mother's response was, "That's nice, honey. Are you seeing anyone yet?" I remember the exact silence that followed. 4 seconds. I counted, because counting was already becoming a habit by then, long before I understood why. Here's the woman who did understand why, and I need you to meet her before I go any further, because she matters more to this story than almost anyone else in it. Her name is Joan Reyes. She's my mother-in-law now, though back then she was just Marcus's mom, and Marcus was the guy I'd started dating my junior year of college. Joan drove 3 hours each way to sit in a folding chair at my college graduation, because my own mother had a hair appointment she said she couldn't move. Joan brought a slow cooker of chicken and dumplings to my studio apartment the week I moved to Denver for my first real job, because she said nobody should eat cereal for dinner the first week in a new city. Joan called me every Sunday at 6 in the evening for the next 6 years, not to check up on me, just to talk, the way you'd call somebody you actually wanted to hear from. I didn't know yet that she would end up being more of a mother to me than the one I was born to. I just knew her chicken and dumplings were better than anyone's, and that when she said, "I'm proud of you," she meant the specific thing I'd done, not some vague idea of me. There's one more thing about those early years worth knowing before I get to the rupture. because it tells you something about how the family actually worked underneath all the church nursery talk and neighborhood watch phone trees. My mother wasn't cruel in an obvious way. She never raised her voice at me, never called me names, never said anything you could screenshot and hold up as proof of anything on its own. What she did was smaller and steadier than that. She organized the family's attention the way a dispatcher organizes trucks, and Meredith always got the good routes. When I got my first real job offer out of college, a supply chain analyst position with a mid-sized regional carrier in Columbus, my mother's response was to ask whether it paid enough to justify living so far from home, 45 minutes away. When Meredith took a part-time job at the elementary school 2 years later, my mother told half the church it was such a blessing having her close. Same distance from the house, roughly, different math entirely. The rupture, the real one, the one that split the 6 years into before and after, happened on a Thursday in March. Quote, I was 28 and hers aunt. I'd been at Cascade Freight Solutions for 4 years by then, started as a regional operations manager for the Rocky Mountain Corridor, and I'd just been offered a promotion to district operations director, a role that covered 9 states and required roughly 2 weeks of travel a month. It came with a real raise, the kind that changes what your bank account looks like, and it came with a level of trust from the company that told me they saw something in me worth investing in. I drove the 6 hours home to tell my parents in person because I was excited, because some part of me still believed that if I showed up with good news often enough, eventually it would land the way it was supposed to. My mother was at the kitchen table shelling peas when I told her. She didn't look up right away. When she did, she said, "So you're choosing the job again?" I said I wasn't choosing anything, I was building a career, and she said, and I remember this word for word because it's the sentence that ends up mattering more than any other sentence in this whole story, she said, "Family doesn't leave for a paycheck, Dana. Don't come home in 10 years wondering why nobody saved you a seat." I want to be clear that I didn't yell. I didn't cry in that kitchen. I said okay, and I finished my coffee and I drove the 6 hours back to Denver with the radio off the entire way. But something in me went quiet that night, and it stayed quiet for a long time. Alright, real quick, because I know some of you are already feeling this one in your chest. If you've ever had somebody twist your ambition into a character flaw, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now where you are. I like knowing who's out there with me on this. Now, to understand what happened over the next 6 years, you have to understand that I didn't stop calling my mother after that conversation. I'm not telling you a story about slamming a door. I'm telling you a story about a door that got quietly, patiently closed from the other side, one small thing at a time, until one day I looked up and realized I was standing outside of it. Year 1. I called home every Sunday, same as always. About half those calls went to voicemail, and my mother would call back 2 or 3 days later, usually with Meredith's news leading the conversation before she asked me anything about mine. That June, Meredith had her first baby, a boy named Tyler, and my mother flew out the day he was born and stayed for 3 weeks. When I mentioned, gently, that I'd love to come meet him soon, my mother said the nursery was a lot right now, and maybe I should wait until things settled. I flew out anyway, on my own dime, 2 months later, and stayed in a hotel because nobody offered me the guest room, which by then had become, permanently, the baby's room for when they visit. That same trip, I sat at my parents' kitchen table with Tyler asleep on my chest, 4 months old, 7 pounds of him warm against my collarbone, and I remember thinking, clear as anything, that I wasn't angry yet. I was still hopeful. I thought distance was a solvable problem, something you could fix with enough flights and enough patience. My mother came in from the garden, saw us like that, and said, "He takes to Meredith so naturally. She's just got that gift." I didn't say anything back. I just kept rocking him, slow, and let the comment land wherever it was going to land. Denver called that October with an offer for a senior analyst role, a real step up, and I remember calling my parents from the parking lot of my old apartment complex, giddy, before I'd even told Marcus. My mother's exact words were, "Well, I suppose that's good for you." 6 words. I know it was 6 because I wrote them on a sticky note that night. Not for the file yet. The file didn't exist yet, just because I wanted to remember exactly how little it had taken to flatten something I'd been excited about for an hour. Year 2, I got promoted again, this time to Vice President of West Coast Operations. It meant relocating to Seattle and a jump in salary that, for the first time in my life, put me in a tax bracket my parents used to joke about like it was science fiction. I called to tell them. My mother's first question was whether I'd still be able to make it home for Meredith's second baby shower in October. I said I'd try. I made it. I sat in the back row of a rented event hall while my mother gave a toast to Meredith about what a natural mother she was, the heart of this family, she called her, and handed her a wrapped gift, a jade green ceramic mixing bowl that had belonged to my grandmother, the one my grandmother always said would go to whichever granddaughter kept the family together. I remember looking at that bowl in Meredith's hands and doing the math in my head, the way I do math on everything, and thinking, there it is. That's the ledger entry. Keep the family together apparently didn't mean building anything. It meant staying close enough to be seen doing it. That same trip, my father hugged me at the door when I left and said, quiet, so my mother wouldn't hear. I saw the article about your company in the trade paper. That's real good, Dana. It was 11 words. I held on to them for longer than I probably should admit, because 11 words from my father was more acknowledgement of my work than I'd gotten from my mother in 2 years combined. I want to pause on that baby shower a little longer, because it's the moment I actually started paying attention on purpose instead of just feeling bruised and moving on. After the toast, after the bowl, my mother made her way around the room introducing Meredith to everyone as though Meredith had accomplished something the rest of the room hadn't already witnessed 100 times. When she got to me, standing near the gift table, she introduced me to her friend Linda Faraday as, this is my other daughter Dana, she's out in Seattle for work. Not what I did. Not what I'd built. Just a location, like I was a weather report. Linda asked, polite, what kind of work, and before I could answer, my mother had already turned to greet someone else. If you've ever been introduced by your zip code instead of your actual life, I need you to know I felt that one specifically, and I'm guessing some of you have too. Go ahead and comment below. Tell me the smallest moment where you first realized you weren't being seen the way your siblings were. Sometimes it's not the big blow-ups that stick with you. It's the 6-word sentences and the introductions that leave you out of your own story. Year 3 is the one where I started keeping the file. I want to explain why, because I know how it sounds, and I promise you it wasn't bitterness, at least not at first. It was instinct. In my job, when something in a supply chain breaks down, you don't fix it by remembering how you feel about it. You fix it by pulling the data. Which shipment, which date, which handoff point failed, how many times has this exact failure happened before? I run operational postmortems for a living. So when I noticed I was flinching every time my phone showed my mother's name, I did what I do at work. I opened a blank spreadsheet and I called it the Bellhaven file, and I started logging it. Not out of spite, out of the same instinct that makes me double-check a manifest. I wanted to know if what I was feeling matched what was actually happening, or if I was imagining it. Item 1, February, my birthday, no card, no call until 4 days later, and the call was to ask if I could wire Meredith and Doug $2,000 toward a down payment, which I did, gladly, because that's not the kind of thing I ever wanted to keep score on. I want to say that clearly. I was never counting the money as a wound. I was counting the pattern. And 2, April, I sent flowers for my parents' anniversary, $42 including delivery, and got a text back 3 days later that said, got them, thanks. Meredith, that same week, hosted a full dinner at their house, and my mother posted 9 pictures of it. Item 11, by August of that year, was the missed graduation. Marcus and I got engaged in June, and I called home to tell them, genuinely happy, genuinely hoping for something warm. My mother's response was to ask when the wedding would be, because she wanted to make sure it didn't step on Meredith's youngest christening, which was tentatively set for the following spring. I told her we hadn't even picked a date yet. She said good, because it would be a lot to ask people to travel twice in one season. Item 12 was smaller than most, and it's the one that comes back to me most often. Honestly, more than some of the bigger ones. I mailed my parents a framed photo from the engagement shoot Marcus and I did in October, a good one, the 2 of us laughing at something off camera, nothing posed. 3 months later, I was home for Christmas and noticed it wasn't up anywhere in the house. Meredith's family portrait from that same year was on the mantel, centered in a frame my mother had clearly chosen with care. Mine was in a drawer in the hallway credenza, still in its shipping envelope unopened. Item 14 was Doug's 40th birthday party that same winter, a full weekend event with a rented hall and a band, to which I received an invitation exactly 9 days before the event, too late to book a flight that wouldn't have cost more than the gift itself. Item 15 was the call, 2 weeks after that party, where my mother mentioned, almost as an aside, how nice it had been having everyone there. I didn't correct her. I just wrote it down. Item 17 was the year my mother forgot my wedding anniversary entirely, the first one, and remembered Meredith and Doug's the same week with a card that arrived on the actual day. Item 18 was a 5-minute phone call in which she asked whether Marcus and I were still doing the traveling thing, or whether we'd settled down for good yet, a question I'd started to recognize as her way of asking when I planned to become someone she recognized again. By year 4, the file had 19 items in it. 19, not 20, not an even number because I wasn't rounding anything, I was recording it the way I'd record a real operational log, exact and unflattering and specific. 19 return calls that came late. 19 small subtractions. And running alongside every single one of those 19 items, in a second column I kept just as carefully, was Joan. Joan flying out for my 30th birthday with a cake she'd baked herself and carried on the plane in a box on her lap. Joan sending a card for every single one of my work milestones, even the small ones, the ones I hadn't told my own mother about because I'd stopped expecting her to care. Joan showing up, unasked, the week I got laid low with the flu in my first winter in Seattle, driving 3 hours with soup and a thermometer, and no expectation that I'd perform gratitude for it. Meanwhile, quietly, in the background of all of this, my career kept moving. That's the part nobody in Belhaven was tracking, because nobody there was looking. By year 4, I'd been named Chief Operating Officer of Cascade Freight Solutions, overseeing 412 employees across 11 distribution hubs. Cascade wasn't some massive national name, but in the regional freight and logistics world, the world Doug Pruitt's warehouse job actually existed inside of. We were the company other companies watched. I got quoted twice in an industry trade publication about efficiency restructuring. I sat on an advisory panel at a logistics conference in Chicago. None of it made it back to Belhaven because I'd stopped bringing it there myself. I wasn't hiding it. I'd just stopped expecting an audience for it. Joan's column in the file, the good column, the one I never showed anyone until that Thursday in the conference room, kept growing right alongside it. She flew out for my COO promotion dinner, a small thing Marcus and I threw at a restaurant near our house, and gave a toast that named 3 specific projects I'd led that year, because she'd actually asked me about them over the phone and remembered the details. She sent a card on the 1-year anniversary of the day I moved to Seattle, just to say she was glad I'd made the leap. When my father-in-law passed unexpectedly that same year, Joan, grieving her own husband, still called me the following Sunday at 6 o'clock, same as always, because she said routines were the thing that kept a person standing. I asked her once why she did all of it, so consistently, when I wasn't even technically her daughter yet. She said, "Consistency isn't a technicality, honey. It's the whole ballgame." I think about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone has ever said to me. There's a specific afternoon from that stretch I keep coming back to. The day I found out I'd made the shortlist for COO, months before it was official, back when it was still just 3 names on an internal memo I wasn't supposed to have seen yet. I called Joan first, before Marcus even, which felt strange at the time and doesn't feel strange at all looking back on it now. She asked me 4 questions in a row, real ones, about the scope of the role, the team size, whether I actually wanted it or just wanted to have earned it, and by the end of that call I understood my own ambition better than I had going into it. My mother, when I told her the news 3 weeks later once it was official, asked whether the new title meant more or less travel, and whether that would affect Thanksgiving. Let's pause here for a second because I want to ask you something. If you've ever built something real while the people who are supposed to be proudest of you weren't even watching, I need you to hear this part of the story, because it changes. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and keep going, because what happens next is the part that made everything before it makes sense. Year 5 is when I found out how my father actually saw all of it, and it's the closest thing to hope this story gives you before the ending, so hold on to it. My father called me directly, which he almost never did. My mother always initiated the calls. He called on a Tuesday afternoon, and I remember thinking something was wrong before he even said anything. He asked how work was going, really asked, wanted the details, wanted to know what a chief operating officer actually does day to day, and I told him, and he listened the whole way through without interrupting once. At the end, he was quiet for a second, and then he said, "I should have driven out for that conference thing in Chicago. Your mother said it was just work, but I looked it up. That was a big deal, wasn't it?" I told him it was. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't come. I think about that more than you'd guess." Then, because that's who my father is, he changed the subject to the Reds bullpen, and we talked baseball for 20 minutes, and neither of us brought it up again. But I wrote it down anyway. Not in the Belhaven file, meant somewhere else. Because that sentence didn't belong with the ledger of what went wrong. It belonged to something separate. Year 6 is the year everything moved fast, so I'm going to slow it down for you here, because every piece of it matters. In January, Cascade's founder and CEO, a man named Harold Vance who'd built the company from 4 trucks in 1988, announced he was retiring at the end of the year. The board began a search, internal and external both, for his replacement. I want to be honest with you, I didn't assume it would be me. I'd been COO for 2 years and I was good at the job, but a jump to president and CEO is not a guaranteed next step for anyone, no matter how good the quarterly numbers look. I put my name in because Harold himself told me to, in a hallway conversation I still remember precisely, down to the exact phrase he used, which was, "You run this place better than I do half the time." Put your name on the list and let the board tell you no if they mean it. Nobody told me no. In September, after a process that involved 4 rounds of interviews with the board and an outside consulting firm, I was named President and Chief Executive Officer of Cascade Freight Solutions. I was 33 years old. I was the first woman to hold that title in the company's 36-year history. I did not call my mother to tell her. I want to sit with that for a second because it matters. It wasn't a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in exhaustion. 6 years of the Belhaven file had taught me something a spreadsheet is actually good for teaching you, which is that a pattern doesn't need you to keep feeding it data to remain true. I already knew what would happen if I called. My mother would ask, in the same breath as congratulating me, whether this meant I'd finally have time to come home more, and somewhere in there she'd mention that Meredith's oldest had made the honor roll, and the whole conversation would end up being about how my success related to Belhaven's approval of it, rather than being simply mine. Instead, I called Joan. She cried on the phone, actual tears, and made Marcus put me on speaker so she could hear it twice. She said, "Dana, honey, I want you to say the whole title out loud again, slow, so I can tell my sister exactly what to call you." That's the kind of pride I'd been missing my whole life without fully knowing it, and I finally had it, just from someone who happened to share my last name by marriage instead of by blood. The Belhaven News Network, and I say that as a joke, but it's not really a joke, found out the way it always finds out things, sideways. My mother's friend from church, Linda Faraday, has a nephew who works logistics dispatch out of Cincinnati, and that nephew's company had recently started routing freight through a new regional partnership with Cascade. Somewhere in an internal onboarding email, my full name and my new title got forwarded around, and Linda mentioned it to my mother at a Tuesday prayer group, casual, the way you'd mention any bit of news. "Isn't that your Dana? President of that whole freight company out west?" Good for her. My mother, according to what I later pieced together, said something like, "Oh, that's right, she's been very busy," and changed the subject, because admitting she hadn't known felt worse to her than the fact of not knowing. It took 11 days from that Tuesday prayer group conversation for my mother to call me. 11 days. And I know it was 11 because I checked the call log against the date Linda's nephew's onboarding email would have gone out, because by then checking things had become who I am, not just what I did at work. When she called, she didn't lead with congratulations. She led with, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said I didn't think it would change much between us. She got quiet, and then she said the word family 3 times in the next 4 sentences, which by then I recognized the way you recognize a familiar smell, before I even knew what she wanted. I found out what she wanted 2 weeks later, and not from her. Meredith's Facebook account is set to public, which has honestly been useful to me over the years in ways I never asked for. In late October, she posted in a private group I'm not part of, but which Doug's cousin, an old high school classmate of mine, happened to be a member of, and screenshotted for me without me even asking, just because she thought it was messed up and wanted me to see it. The screenshot showed a message thread. Meredith had written, "Mom thinks Dana can get Doug in somewhere at that freight company she works at. She's basically running the whole thing now, apparently. Mom's going to have her make a call." Someone in the group replied asking if that felt weird, going through Dana after everything, and Meredith wrote back, "Whatever works. Doug's been out of work for 6 weeks. He's not picky. And honestly, she owes us a little goodwill after acting so distant all these years." I read that message 3 times. Not because I was confused about what it meant, I understood it perfectly the first time, but because I wanted to be sure I was reading it the way it actually said, and not the way 6 years of pattern recognition wanted me to read it. 51 words. I counted them, the same way I count everything now. 51 words to summarize an entire decade of a relationship as a favor bank with a balance due. I didn't respond to anyone in the group. I didn't confront Meredith. I did what I've trained myself to do with information like that, which is what I do at work when I find a discrepancy in a shipping manifest. I saved it. I documented the date, the source, and the content, and I filed it calmly in a folder that already had a name, because I'd made that folder years ago without fully admitting to myself why. I called it contingency. I sat with that screenshot for 2 full days before I told anyone. Not because I was hiding it, but because I wanted to be sure my reaction to it was actually about what it said, and not about 6 years of accumulated exhaustion looking for somewhere to land. I read it again Wednesday night and again Thursday morning over coffee, and both times it said the same 51 words it had said the first time. Whatever works. She's not picky. She owes us a little goodwill. There was no version of rereading it that made it mean something gentler. Then I called Marcus, and I told him everything, and I told him what I thought was coming. He asked me one question, which was the right question, the only question that mattered. He said, "What do you actually want to happen when she calls?" I told him the truth. I didn't want revenge. I wasn't building a case to destroy anybody. I just wanted, for once in this family, for the truth to be spoken out loud in the same room instead of managed around a kitchen table. He said okay, and he said he'd be there whenever it happened, wherever I wanted it to happen. I also called our general counsel at Cascade the following Monday, not because I thought I needed legal protection from my own mother, but because I wanted to understand, cleanly, what our actual hiring process looked like for a role like the one Doug would be applying for, so that if this conversation happened, I could speak to it accurately instead of emotionally. I learned that Cascade has a standard applicant tracking process for warehouse and operations roles, that hiring managers below the executive level make those decisions with HR, and that any executive recommendation gets logged and disclosed the same as anyone else's referral. No fast track, no side door. That's exactly what I wanted to know going in. 9 days after the Facebook screenshot, my mother called and asked if she could come see me. Not a phone call this time, in person. She said Meredith and Doug would come too, to talk about something as a family. I said yes. And then, because I've learned that in my line of work, whoever picks the room usually keeps the leverage, I told her I'd meet them, but at my office, not at a restaurant, not at my house. I said I had a conference room available Thursday at 11, and I'd have someone show them up. If you're the kind of person who's ever had to sit across a table from someone who thinks they still hold all the cards, you already know the particular kind of calm that settles over you right before that meeting. Before I take you into that room, hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because what my mother said in the next 15 minutes is the whole reason I wrote this story down in the first place, and I want you here for it. Cascade's headquarters sit on the 8th floor of a glass building downtown, and the conference room I chose has a wall of windows looking out over the freight yards, which felt right, honestly, symbolically right, though I didn't plan it that way. My assistant, a sharp 26-year-old named Priya, who has no idea how much weight this particular Thursday would end up carrying, buzzed me at 10,058 to say my guests had arrived. I walked out to the lobby myself instead of having her bring them back, because I wanted to see my mother's face the exact moment she understood. She saw the sign first. Cascade Freight Solutions, etched in brushed steel above the reception desk, with a smaller plaque beside it listing Executive Leadership, my name at the top, Dana Whitfield, President and Chief Executive Officer. I watched her read it twice. Her mouth opened slightly and then closed again, the way it does when she's recalculating something in real time and doesn't want anyone to see the math happening. Meredith just stared. Doug, to his credit, looked like a man who understood exactly how badly he needed this conversation to go well and had no idea, yet, how complicated it was about to get. We sat down. I didn't sit at the head of the table out of some petty power move. I sat where I always sit, which happens to be the head of the table because it's my conference room. My mother had brought a folder. She set it on the table between us before anyone had said more than hello, and she opened it and slid it toward me, and inside was a single typed page, Doug's resume, along with a handwritten note in my mother's careful cursive listing 3 reasons Doug deserved a shot: his work ethic, his 2 young children, and the fact that he'd always treated the family right. She said, "We were hoping, since you're in a position to help now, that you could just make sure his resume gets a real look. You know how these things work, Dana. A call from the right person opens the door. You owe us that much, after everything, for us to at least be able to say we tried. You owe us that much." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because I sat with it too, right there at that table, and it landed exactly the way you'd expect the closing argument of a 6-year case to land. It was the same phrase, almost word for word, that Meredith had used in that Facebook thread. It wasn't an accident of language. It was the family's actual position, spoken plainly at last, out loud, at my own table. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be honest with you about that because it would be easy, telling this story, to make myself the hero who finally said her piece with fire in her voice, and that's not what happened, and it's not who I am. I opened my laptop instead, calm, the way I open it in any operational review, and I turned the screen toward them. I said, "Before we talk about Doug, I want to walk you through something. I run a company that moves freight through 11 distribution hubs, and the way I do that is by tracking patterns, because patterns tell you the truth faster than any single incident does. 6 years ago, I started keeping a record of our family, not because I wanted to build a case against anyone, because I wanted to know if what I was feeling was real or if I was imagining it. I read them. Item 1, the missed birthday call, 4 days late. Item 2, the flowers that got a 3-word text back the same week Meredith got 9, posted photos of a dinner. I read them. Item 11, the christening scheduling comment. I read them. Item 19, I told them there were 43 items total by the time I stopped adding to the file 2 months ago, and I told them the exact date I stopped, because I stopped the week I decided this conversation was going to happen one way or another, and there was no more use in documenting a pattern I already understood completely. My mother's face had gone very still. Meredith was the one who broke first, not her, which the family dynamic in that room had never once allowed to happen before. She said, "This is insane, you kept a spreadsheet about us?" I said yes. I said it the way I'd say it to a board member questioning an audit. Then I turned the laptop again and showed them the screenshot, dated, time-stamped, the message where she'd told her group chat that I owed the family goodwill, that Doug wasn't picky, that whatever works, works. For 4 seconds, nobody in that room said a word. I counted them, out of habit, the same habit that started this whole file in the first place. My mother recovered first, or tried to. She said, "You've been sitting on that for weeks, waiting to use it against us? That's not normal, Dana. That's not how a healthy person handles feeling left out." I told her I understood why she'd want to make this about my methods instead of the message, because it's easier to criticize a spreadsheet than to sit with what's actually in it. I said I wasn't interested in relitigating whether keeping records made me strange. I'd built a career on exactly that instinct, and it had never once failed me. What I wanted to know, plainly, was whether she'd actually expected me to make that call without ever asking whether it was even mine to make, or whether she'd assumed the title alone meant I owed the favor automatically, the same way she'd always assumed my presence in this family was owed automatically no matter how it was treated. Meredith tried to jump back in here, said something about how none of this was about keeping score. Families help each other, that's just what people do. I looked at her and said, "Calm. You wrote 51 words in a group chat that disagree with you." That's when her face changed, when she understood I wasn't guessing at what had been said behind my back. I had it, dated and sourced, the same way I'd have it if it were a vendor discrepancy at work. My mother was the one who spoke first. And here's the part I want you to really hear, because this is the moment the whole family vindication story either earns its ending or falls apart trying to fake one. My mother's composure cracked, genuinely, for the first time in my entire adult life. Her hands, folded on the table in front of her, started to shake slightly, and her voice, when it came, was lower than I'd ever heard it. She said, "Do you have any idea what it's like watching your daughter build a whole life somewhere else and knowing you're not part of it?" I didn't know how to say I was scared of losing you, so I just kept acting like you'd already left. That was true. I believed her when she said it, I still believe it now, and it is the single most honest sentence my mother has said to me in 6 years. And then, within maybe 8 seconds, she pulled it back. She straightened up, wiped under her eye with one knuckle, and said, "But that doesn't change that you have the ability to help your own family and you're sitting here punishing us with a computer file instead." That's the crack, and that's the retreat, both in the same breath, and I want you to notice that I'm not editing that part out to make her look worse than she is. That's exactly what happened, word for word, as close as memory lets me get it. She's not a cartoon villain. She's a woman who is afraid of losing me and turned that fear into control for 6 straight years, and even in the one moment she told the truth about it, she couldn't sit in that truth for longer than 8 seconds before reaching for the next demand. I closed the laptop. I said, "Doug is welcome to apply for any open role at Cascade the same way anyone else does. I can have Priya send the current openings list before you leave today. What I won't do is call our hiring manager and ask them to treat his resume differently than anyone else's, because that's not how I run this company, and honestly, it's not how I want to run this family either. Not as a favor bank." Doug, who had been almost silent the entire meeting, said quietly, "That's fair, Dana. I didn't even want it to go like this. I told Carol I'd rather just send it in myself." My mother shot him a look I'd seen my whole life, the one that means sit down and let me handle it, but for the first time, in that room, Doug didn't sit down. He said, "I'll apply through the website. Thank you for the openings list." That's the part of this story where an ally who's been mostly silent through the whole scene finally speaks up, and it mattered more to me than anything my mother said. My mother tried one more angle. She said, "So that's it? 6 years of this and you're not even going to help family?" And here's the line I want to leave with you from that room, because it's the one I'd actually planned quiet in the car on the way in that morning, the one piece of that meeting that wasn't purely reactive. I said, "You told me 6 years ago that family doesn't leave for a paycheck." "I didn't leave for a paycheck, Mom. I left because I wanted a life. And you decided that meant I'd left you. I'm not punishing anybody. I'm just done pretending the door was ever actually open." Marcus, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner chair by the window the entire meeting, exactly where I'd asked him to sit, stood up at that point and said only, "I think we're finished here. and walked around to stand beside me. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. His presence did the thing words couldn't. My mother left first, gathering her folder off the table with hands that were still not quite steady. Meredith followed her out without looking at me. Doug stayed behind for maybe 30 seconds, just long enough to shake my hand, actually shake it, like a colleague, and say, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about all of it. I should have said something years ago." Then he left too. I sat in that conference room by myself for a few minutes after they'd gone, looking out at the freight yards, watching trucks I was ultimately responsible for pull in and out of their bays in a rhythm I understood better than almost anything else in my life. Priya knocked and asked if I needed anything. I told her I was fine. Hui, I mostly meant it. If you've ever had a moment where the people who spent years making you feel small finally had to sit across from the person you actually became, I hope you felt that scene the way I felt living it. Before I tell you what happened after, drop a comment for me. Tell me honestly, if someone showed up in your life only after your circumstances changed, what did you do? I read every single one of these, and I want to hear your version of this story too. Here's what happened in the months after. Doug applied through Cascade's website, like he said he would, for a warehouse operations supervisor position in our Denver hub, one tier below what he'd been doing at his old job. He went through the same 3 rounds of interviews everyone goes through, with a hiring manager named Tomas, who had never heard of me getting personally involved and never will, because I made sure of it. I asked Priya, afterward, to confirm for me that my name never once appeared anywhere in his file, not as a referral, not as a note, nothing. It didn't. Doug got the job on his own, 6 weeks later, on a starting salary about 11% lower than what he'd made before, but full benefits and a real path forward if he performed. He sent me a text when he got the offer. It said, "Got it. Well, did it myself. Thank you for not making it easy." I keep that text. It's the only message from anyone in my mother's orbit that's ever made me smile reading it back. I heard, secondhand, the way I hear most things out of Bellhaven now, that my mother told people at church Doug had gotten a good job through the family connection, which isn't true, and which Doug himself apparently corrected, more than once, according to Linda Faraday's nephew, who still keeps me distantly informed whether I ask him to or not. I don't know why that detail matters to me as much as it does. Maybe because it's such a small thing, and my mother still couldn't help herself around it. Even after the conference room, even after the 8 seconds of honesty, the story she told her own community was the version where I'd finally done my part, rather than the version where Doug had done his. Meredith and I haven't spoken since that Thursday. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't sit somewhere in me, some quiet room I don't visit often. She's my sister, and some nights I think about Tyler and her younger two, growing up without knowing much about their aunt beyond whatever version of me gets discussed at Sunday dinners I'm not invited to. Tyler is 9 now. He sent me a birthday card last spring, on his own, using an address he must have gotten from our father, a few crayon words and a drawing of what I think was supposed to be a semi-truck, because Doug must have told him what his aunt does for work. I still have it taped inside my desk drawer at the office, where I see it every day I open that drawer for a pen. I haven't written back yet. I don't entirely know what a safe reply looks like, when the parent standing between us hasn't asked me a single question about my life in 4 months. I think about Meredith sometimes not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of tired curiosity. I wonder if she ever reread that message in the group chat the way I did, 3 times, turning each word over. I wonder if she thinks about the fact that it was her own sentence, not mine, that ended up read aloud at that table. I don't know. I'm not sure it's my job to wonder for her. But I'm not going to chase a relationship that only ever existed on the terms of who my mother decided deserved the good bowl. My mother has not called. It's been 4 months as of the day I'm recording this. No apology, no follow-up, nothing. I've heard, through my father, that she tells people at church I'm very busy with the company, which is true, and also the exact same sentence she used the day she found out about my promotion 11 days late and didn't want to admit she hadn't known. I don't expect that to change, and I've made a kind of peace with that. Some doors close for good reasons, even when the person on the other side never quite agrees they deserve to be closed. My father is different, and this is the part of the story I actually want to end on, before the final word to you. About 7 weeks after that meeting, my father called me on a Tuesday afternoon again, same as he had a year earlier. He asked how work was going, listened the whole way through, no interrupting. Then he said something I wasn't ready for. He said, "I want to come visit, just me. I want to see the office, if that's all right. I want to see the thing you built." I told him he didn't need an invitation, he could come whenever he wanted. He came 3 weeks later, alone, driving the whole way himself rather than flying, which he said gave him time to think about what he wanted to say. I gave him a full tour of the Denver hub, the loading docks, the dispatch floor, the conference room with the windows, the same room where everything had happened 7 weeks earlier, though I didn't tell him that until later. He walked slow through the warehouse, hands in his jacket pockets, nodding at things the way he used to nod at the feed mill equipment, like he was reading a machine he respected even if he didn't fully understand every part of it. He asked good questions. How many trucks move through here a day? What happens when a shipment's late? Whether I still did any of the actual routing myself, or whether that was all somebody else's job now. I told him I still like to sit in on it sometimes, that I missed the puzzle of it. He said that made sense to him. He said the feed mill was the same, 29 years in, and he never stopped liking the sound the grain made moving through the chutes, even after it stopped being new. At the end, standing in the lobby under that brushed steel sign with my name on it, he got quiet for a minute, reading it again the way my mother had read it 7 weeks before, though his face did something entirely different with it. He said, I keep thinking about all the things I let slide because your mother made the noise and I just went along with the quiet. That conference in Chicago. The graduation you drove home from with nobody asking about it. I should have been the one who called anyway, even when she didn't. I know sorry doesn't fix 6 years, but I am. I'm sorry, Dana. His voice caught a little on the word sorry, and he cleared his throat and looked out the window at the yards instead of at me, the way men of his generation do when a feeling gets bigger than they know how to hold steady. I told him I appreciated it, and I meant it, and I told him we could start slow. No pressure to fix everything at once. No expectation of the family dinners he used to skip, just him and me, talking, building something real and small instead of performing something big and hollow. He's called every other Tuesday since. Not every Sunday, the way Joan does. We haven't built that rhythm yet, and I'm not in a hurry to force it. But every other Tuesday, without fail, for 5 months now. Last week he asked whether he could bring my mother next time he visited. I told him not yet. He said he understood and he didn't push it, and that alone told me more about how much he'd actually heard in that conference room than any single sentence could have. That's where things stand with my father now. Slow, honest, real, in the ways it's able to be real. And that jade green mixing bowl, the one my grandmother said would go to whichever granddaughter kept the family together, the one my mother handed to Meredith at that baby shower all those years ago, Joan found the same bowl, or one close enough to it, at an antique shop outside of Denver last spring, and gave it to me for my birthday without any explanation, just wrapped it and set it on the table and said, I know it's not the same one. I just thought you should have your own. It sits on my kitchen counter now. I use it every Sunday when Marcus and I have Joan and my father over for dinner, the 4 of us, at 6:30, the same time Joan used to call me every week for 6 straight years just to talk. I make a roast most Sundays, nothing fancy, the kind of meal my mother used to make when I was small, before I understood there'd ever be a difference between the food she cooked and the way she loved. Joan brings dessert, always, some variation on a recipe she's had since before Marcus was born. My father brings nothing but himself and, lately, questions about the business, real ones, the kind that tell me he's actually been thinking about our conversations between the calls. Last Sunday he asked whether Cascade had ever considered opening a hub closer to Ohio. I told him we'd looked at it twice and passed both times, not enough freight volume yet to justify it. He nodded, satisfied, like he'd wanted the honest answer more than a hopeful one. That's the kind of relationship we're building now. Slow, true, unhurried by either of us. I still have the Belhaven file. I haven't deleted it, and I don't plan to. 43 items, dated and sourced, sitting in a folder on a hard drive that nobody but me will ever open again unless I choose to. I don't keep it out of anger anymore. I keep it the way I'd keep any closed audit, as a record of something that happened and mattered and is now, simply, finished. Some nights I think about updating it with one more entry, a 5th column almost, not a grievance and not quite a repair either, just a note. Father, item 1. Pulled on his own, drove 3 hours, said sorry, and meant it. That's the only entry I've added since the conference room, and I suspect, for a long while yet, it may be the only one. That's my story. 6 years, 43 items in a spreadsheet, and one jade green bowl that finally belongs to the right person for the right reason. Here's what I want you to take from it, if you take anything at all. Family isn't the people who show up once the numbers change in your favor. It's the people who showed up when there was nothing on the table but you. If somebody made you feel small for building a life on your own terms, you don't owe them a phone call just because you finally have the power to make one. You get to decide, calmly, on your own terms, exactly like you built everything else. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one.